Thank you once again for making Locked On Cougars your first listen of the day. Hope you all are doing well. Another plug for you guys, if you've not done so already, join the Locked On Cougars Insider Group. Get the inside scoop on all things BYU sports and be in the know when it comes to all things Cougars. And the best part is you get a 14-day free trial before you're charged anything. It's just $5 a month after that to be a part of the Insiders Group. So I would encourage you guys to join us today. The link is, by the way, is in the show notes below, whether you're watching this on YouTube or listening wherever you get your podcasts. All right, before we go on today's show, there was some reporting late last week, early this week, that the Big 12 and Brett Yormark have essentially renewed their work in trying to secure funds to hopefully chase down or at least somewhat chase down the SEC and the Big Ten in terms of their payouts and the overall money coming into their programs. Now, it's been labeled as private equity, but the more I read about this, I think that private equity label has been mislabeled into what the Big 12 is looking at, because as I understand it, and our friend Matt Brown over at Extra Points in his fantastic newsletter has pointed this out, that the Big 12 and college athletics in general are not necessarily looking at private equity, because equity, essentially, when you have a private equity firm that signs on to do something, they have a stake and they have, in many cases, a large say in what the future of whatever they're invested in is going to do. That is a step too far, I think, for the 16 members of the Big 12 to allow some private equity firm to have a stake at the table and be able to say, hey, you guys should do this, this, and this. And if you don't, we're going to yank our funding. The difference is it appears that the Big 12 is looking at what is called private capital. Private capital is more where you have these their funds, they're an equity fund, but the capital invests money into the Big 12, but does not have a seat at the table in terms of the decision-making for the conference. That is where I think that we're kind of missing things here, because knowing what I know of how BYU operates, I'd be hard-pressed to believe that BYU would ever willingly relinquish any type of control over what the future of Brigham Young University and BYU athletics is going to have, and let some equity firm have a say over what BYU, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints who runs it, allow them to direct or send directives to BYU. I just don't see that happening. BYU is not going to let that happen under really any circumstance, just based on what I understand about how BYU operates. Now, if private capital wants to come in this and be that, I don't want to call it a silent partner. That's not really the role that they take, but they invest capital, which is money, into the conference, bolster the athletic departments with that money, and then you move forward with that. Yeah, you sign on with that, no problem, it feels like. This is an arms race, and there's zero doubt that BYU is making more money than they ever have before. I talked about it earlier on in today's podcast, that we're living in some pretty incredible times for BYU. They've got multi-million/billionaire NIL investments from some of the leading minds in the tech sphere here in Utah. They're making more money in TV rights than ever. But the simple fact of the matter is, if they want to stay flush with cash and continue to compete at the top tier level that the SEC and the Big Ten look poised to take college athletics, and in particular college football and college basketball to, well, you need as much money as possible, and that's where I think this private capital could do some good for the Big 12 Conference. I applaud that Brett Yormark is thinking outside the box. Yes, I know it's worrisome when you hear, private equity, because, like I said, private equity firms can be a bit of a hiss and a byword, to use that LDS expression, because they can wreak havoc. And I don't think that the Big 12, and especially BYU, would sign on without doing their due diligence on what they're signing the dotted line to do in terms of, okay, how much money you're giving us and what are we having to cede control over. These are your institutions, speaking of universities, who have multi-million, if not multi-billion-dollar endowments. And they're not going to allow, I don't think, really anybody to have a say over controlling what they want to control, and that's their future. So I applaud what the Brett Yormarks of the world are doing here to try and make up that revenue gap for the Big 12 Conference. And if I'm wrong about this and it is private equity, yeah, then I have a concern with it. But everything I have read, I think it's been mislabeled. Speaking of, we're taking money from a private equity firm for the Big 12. it's more private capital. And any of you who, like me, are not expert economists, I live with two guys who studied econ at BYU. They're two of my dear friends to this day that are econ majors and have gone to do incredible things in the econ sphere. They can explain it better than I could. Many of you probably know somebody like that. I would encourage you to talk to them about the difference between equity and private equity and private capital. But this is, I think, a course worth following for the Big 12 Conference, simply due to the fact that they want to stay relevant on a national stage and avoid that dreaded super conference coming about, and BYU and a handful of other Big 12 schools essentially hoping to win that rat race to make it into that Super League. Well, the only way to counter that is to make yourself relevant on a national level. And as we have seen, it's an arms race. I've used that expression a few times today. You have to have money to compete. And I don't see BYU throwing millions of dollars just at what they consider a money pit to stay relevant in college athletics. They'll stay competitive so long as it's in their best interest and it serves the greater interest of Brigham Young University and obviously the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I think there's a very strong leadership core at the top of BYU led by Shane Reese and Keith Vorking, who understand what athletics can do for BYU. Tom Holmoe has been a champion for BYU athletics for decades. Whoever takes over that AD chair when Tom steps aside, they obviously will have to champion it as well. But I also think that the Board of Education that leads BYU up in Salt Lake City, I think right now they understand that athletics, it's having a tangible positive effect on BYU, on the church. And so long as that continues, I think you'll continue to see things go the way they're going for BYU. And if it requires a multi-million-dollar investment from a private capital firm that can yet again bolster BYU's chances of competing on a national stage and thereby raising the profile of the university and the LDS church, by all means, go for it. Really, the only thing I think could pull the reins back on this for BYU is the Board of Education gets skittish if there is a scandal of some sort, or if, like I said, it is a private equity firm and they're just like, we're not so keen on teaming up with somebody who could essentially issue directives to us about what we're supposed to do. That could be the only thing I think that could pull it back from where it's going right now. But so long as there's none of those type of parameters in place, yeah, go for it. Chase down everything you have and every opportunity you have to make up that revenue gap, because the SEC and the Big Ten ain't slowing down anytime soon. And the ACC, as I talked about with Drake Toller earlier this week on the podcast, it feels like it's going to implode in the next 5-6 years, because you're going to see those top tier programs in that league bolt as soon as the dollar figure hits a number they feel like they can afford. So if you're the Big 12, forge ahead and try and make up as much ground as you can right now and force it from being that top 2 league discussion to maybe being the top 3 and stay relevant on a national stage. And BYU will be right in the thick of that. And that should excite you as a Cougar fan, because that shows that BYU, they're investing heavily. It's strategic. It's smart. They're never going to obviously go out and run in the red. They'll be running in the black. But this is an exciting time once again for BYU sports. And if the Big 12 can get that infusion of capital to make up that gap a little bit more and keep these programs, including BYU, competing on a national level, I'm all for it. Sign them up. Let's do this thing. All right, that's where I'll step off the soapbox for today's show. But as always, thank you for y'all's support. Hope you guys will consider subscribing, rating, reviewing. If you're new to the podcast, like the show. Join us every single day. This is daily coverage of BYU sports in podcast form. And we're going more and more, it feels like, to that era where you get what you want when you want it. Well, we're here for you every single day talking BYU sports. So as always, thank you for making Locked On Cougars your first listen of the day. And once again, thank you for being everydayers with us right here on the Locked On Cougars podcast.